Dear virtual audience, it is my honor and my pleasure to welcome you today to the Latvian Institute of International Affairs Riga Security Forum 2021 podcast sessions. And our podcast sessions also feature a video, which is an additional plus. Today, the topic is quite wide, and it is the security outlooks of the big power era, but we have a panel of excellent speakers who are absolutely up to the task. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce. First, we have Julia Vu. Now, Julia Vu is a cyber fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, and she leads the team behind Belfer's National Cyberpower Index. Now, that is an index that most of us have used in our research. It is a very influential data set. Formerly, Julia was the research director for the China Cyber Policy Initiative. Her areas of research concern geotech strategy. She looks at the digital Silk Road, industrial policy, and tech standards for strategic technologies. Julia has research affiliations with Oxford, Leiden, and Johns Hopkins. Actually, Julia also has an experience from the proverbial other side, so to speak. She's an ex-diplomat. She has served at the British Embassy in Beijing, covering China's cyber and artificial intelligence policy from a commercial perspective, and also she's looked into technical standards in that role. During her time in Beijing, Julia has also worked for the EU delegation in China, Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, and also in her diplomatic career, she spent time at the UK Cabinet Office. I would have to say that Julia's research is widely featured in international news outlets such as The Economist, The Financial Times, and so on and so forth. So it's great to have Julia here with us today. Now, please let me introduce our second panelist, and we have Dr. Bobo Lo. Now, Dr. Bobo Lo is one of the, if not the leading voice on Russia's place in the world order today. He is a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute, an independent analyst and associate research fellow with the Russia NIS Center at the French Institute of International Affairs. And previously, we all know Bobo Lo from his role as the head of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House. Bobo, just like Julia, has quite a diplomatic experience. He was the deputy head of mission at the Australian Embassy in Moscow, and as an author, he's written extensively on Russian foreign and security policy, especially during his recent book with a particular focus on Sino-Russian relations. Now, actually, Bobo is one of the first to even speak about this Russia-China axis of convenience back when nobody else had noticed it. So I'm curious to hear how will he characterize the relationship now. Now, Bobo is the author of Russia and the New World Disorder, a critically acclaimed research publication book, described by The Economist as the best attempt yet to explain Russia's unhappy relationship with the West, with the rest of the world, whereas his latest book, A Wary Embrace, What the China-Russia Relationship Means for the World, is specifically interesting for us today because it looks at these two Eurasian giants and their relationship. Now, Bobo has an MA from Oxford and a PhD from Melbourne University. So, indeed, a lot of knowledge in this room today. Please let me go first to Julia for some opening remarks. Please, Julia.
Thanks so much, Ina. Thank you for the really warm welcome, and I'm so happy to be on this panel and also to discuss these issues with Bobo and learn from Bobo. So just a few comments. So the security outlooks that I am kind of most interested in arise as a result of our increasing dependency on technology and its evolution into a new tool of statecraft. So within this, there's some of the activities to watch, or that I think will be most interesting over the next few years in terms of how governments will deal with it are: 1, destructive attacks, 2, the manipulation of the information environment, and 3, competition over the governance of technology and data. So by cyber attacks, I mean, destructive attacks, I mean cyber attacks by both states and non-state actors. And so, it's not the case anymore that cyber is like an invisible conflict. We take, for instance, the kind of real world consequences of the ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline earlier in May. Ransomware is where hackers get inside computer networks and lock owners out until a ransom is paid. And this affected one of the largest US pipelines, that supplies about 45% of the oil to the East Coast. And so what is interesting here is that, that this was a non-state actor, and so there's a question around how states will deal with non-state actors. And in this scenario, I think they were residing in Russia and potentially neighboring areas. And secondly, when it comes to state actors, there has also been a trend for governments, particularly on the West and Five Eyes, is to name and shame them. And how effective is that actually at reducing the likelihood of future attacks? The second one is manipulation of the information environment. So here I'm talking about misinformation and disinformation. I would say misinformation is the spreading of, for those of you who don't know, the spreading of false information with no malicious intent. Disinformation is the spreading of false information with malicious intent to shape public opinion and perceptions. And so this is actually one of the trends that I find the scariest, because it's kind of so insidious, and everyone is in their own bubble of information. And so, and one of the areas where I think this is particularly risky is, in countries that are democratic, that rely on elections rely on competitive processes, faith in electoral institutions, and also informed participation. So these kinds of efforts to influence the information environment could be really problematic for our societies. And finally, competition over governance of technology and data. And so here is kind of my pet, the thing that I love to think about is international standards, which make a lot of people yawn, but it's basically how technology is shaped by technical standards and who influences and why and where. And we're seeing a lot more efforts around kind of collaborating on technical standards. There were some agreements from, I think, the G7, D10, also the Quad, and also on an individual level from countries and around controlling data. We're seeing a lot more efforts around data governance and data localization, not just in more authoritarian countries who are trying to control data, but also in established democracies. So these are just a few things that I wanted to just state at the beginning.
Thank you. Indeed, very insightful remarks. Now, against this background, my question to Bobo is almost redundant, which is, why would you say there is a new world disorder rather than order? What defines it? However, I'm sure that Bobo will maybe take it away in a different direction. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. Now, Western policymakers and observers routinely refer to the so-called rules-based international order, sometimes known as the liberal international order. But it seems to me that it's unclear what the rules are, what moral authority underpins those rules, and to whom they even apply and who obeys them. It seems to me that the liberal vision of a rules-based international order in practice, if not in theory, in practice is over. Yet at the same time, no alternative vision of global order has supplanted the liberal vision. And nor is it likely to do so anytime soon. Now, of course, Moscow and Beijing, they speak of a multipolar order, sometimes a polycentric system of international relations. But these are fictions, these are abstractions. At best, they are vague aspirations. Now, sometimes you hear people, and it's become very fashionable recently, to talk of a great power-centered order, a concert of great powers. And yet, here's the irony. We are said to be living in an age of great powers. yet they have seldom been more impotent. They are neither able to bend others to their will, nor are they able to address the fundamental challenges facing humanity, like climate change, like pandemic disease. Traditional great power diplomacy, in my view, is obsolete, and there is zero future in a concert arrangement. So if the liberal order is essentially obsolete, if there is no new multipolar order to replace it, and a great power-centered order is an abstraction, a fiction, then it seems to me it's not that we don't just have no rules-based international order, a liberal version. We have no order at all. What we have instead is a world disorder. The global environment is more fluid and anarchic than at any time, I think, in the last 2 centuries. Now, of course, it's tempting to blame Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or Donald Trump for this state of affairs. But I would argue that the unraveling of world order is in fact a longer-term structural process that was kick-started by George W. Bush and his fateful decision to invade Iraq in 2003. Now, you asked about what the features, what defines a new world disorder. I think there are a number of essential characteristics. I think the most fundamental is a lack of agreement over the rules of the international system, and this has encouraged serial rule breaking. The former British Foreign Secretary David Miliband spoke about an age of impunity. I think we are seeing the de-universalization of international norms. Now, Julia spoke about international technical norms. The problem is, it's not just international technical norms, it's a real problem with agreeing a universal set of standards in any sphere of human activity. I think, we are also seeing the much diminished authority of the great powers. So there's no great power order because the great powers have got feet of clay. At the same time, we are seeing the widespread denigration of multilateralism and multilateral institutions. We are also in the midst of a crisis of international leadership in both democratic and authoritarian systems that, in my view, is worse than at any time since the 1930s. We live in a hyper-globalized, yet also fragmenting world in which there are intensifying conflicts over identity, culture, and of course, ideology. And we live in an anarchic information space, what some people call a post-truth world, that is dominated by competing narratives, competing truths. And in the meantime, humanity faces colossal challenges. Well, obviously, accelerating climate change, the aggravation of global poverty and inequality, great power confrontation, and most recently, pandemic disease. And governments and societies alike are struggling also to adapt to an age of breakneck technological and informational transformation. So those are the essential features of the world disorder. Now, disorder doesn't necessarily mean conflict, but of course it means that conflict is more likely to happen. It also severely constrains our ability to address a whole range of challenges, domestic, regional, and global.
Thank you. So food for thought here, a common thread both in Julius and Bobo's intervention. I would say that the West is not a victim of this changing situation, but actually an active party to the unraveling of the Great World Order, as well as some dubious practices of data and tech governance. I think both of you made that point. However, Bobo, just a quick comeback. Now, you'd say that now we have rules breaking on a serial scale in the international system. But don't the big guys always break a rule here and there? Isn't that kind of baked in, that they're allowed to do these kinds of things as long as they keep most of the rules most of the time?
look, you make a very fair point. I mean, you can always argue that the world throughout history has always been disorderly and anarchic to some degree. I think what we're seeing, though, is not just occasional examples, incidents of rule-breaking behavior, but rather that rule-breaking behavior has become systematized. It's become normalized. So it's no longer an aberration. It's become the new normal.
Thank you. And against this grim background, what are the implications for the little guys out there, such as right here by the Baltic shores, and even for the medium guys who obviously cannot compete against these normalized rule breakers anymore?
I think it cuts both ways, because on the one hand, you've got a breakdown of international norms, you've got a more systematized rule-breaking behavior, and clearly that heightens the insecurities of smaller states like the Baltic states. But there is an upside, strangely enough, which is that because the great powers have seldom been less able to impose their will or persuade smaller and medium-sized states, that means there is more latitude, more room for maneuver for these smaller and medium-sized states. So in other words, they may be more insecure, but they also have more autonomy and more choice. So I think, there's both an up and a downside to this.
Thank you. Now, Julia, let me turn to you. Bobo just made a point that the big powers are getting weaker. Is it also the dynamic that you see in terms of their cyberspace activities, or is it a different story in the cyberspace?
Well, I think that weaker in a sense, because in a way the ability, cyber power is more easily accessible for smaller powers, if that makes sense. So for us, the way that we define it in our research, cyber power is not just about conducting the offensive operations to take down an adversary's infrastructure, but it includes a whole host of other cyber operations that contribute to states' overall influence. So one is, and control. So one is surveilling and monitoring domestic groups, being able to enhance national defenses, controlling the information environment, as I mentioned earlier, intelligence gathering, commercial gain, and also defining international cyber norms and tech governance. And, from the way that we see it is that it's not just important for the country or the government to be able to capable of conducting these operations, but also having the intent to do so. So for example, when we're talking about small countries versus large countries, if we look at our index for last year, the kind of no surprises in the top top spots of the US and China, but then we have the UK in the third place, followed by Russia, and the fifth place was the Netherlands, which came up as a surprise for a lot of observers when this index came out. But I think what we found, one thing is to say is that our research is based on publicly available data. So there is kind of that limitation there. But what we're seeing is a leveling of the playing field. For example, if we consider DPRK, most people, when they talk about cyber powers, DPRK is up there, and they're one of the least developed countries in the world on many vectors or angles. So, cyber power kind of reduces the gap in capability between the big powers and the small powers.
Yeah.
To pull on that thread a little further, during your initial remarks, you also outlined the growing role of non-state actors in these disruptions, and that also probably contributes to this weakness of the state actors, no matter how big and mighty, in the cyberspace. So would you also say that this analysis saying that, cyber power has been more accessible now, that also contributes to this disbalance and the loss of roles of great powers due to the rise of the non-state actors, due to this asymmetry that's introduced into this new system?
Yeah, absolutely, Una. Like, in my opening remarks, the kind of non-state actor that I was referring to were the ones behind the colonial pipeline attacks, and we're seeing a lot of criminal gangs getting involved in these kind of ransomware attacks, and also I think around kind of more fintech, crypto related cyber operations. But then I think in terms of non-state actors, we're also seeing them coming in. Well, they've always been there and shaping technology, right? In a lot of the forums where we're shaping the international standards, it's like state actors, but a majority actually companies, technical experts, academia, and because this is becoming a much more important field for national government, so that we're seeing efforts to like insert themselves in standards development organizations that are traditionally led by non-government players. So I think certainly the power has diluted in a way, or there are just more players at the table, and I think in many respects you need them there. Obviously they're the ones that control the infrastructure, that are kind of conducting the R&D, and I think it's going to be a really interesting balance for countries to strike in terms of building coalitions with industry, if they will need to, if they want to enhance their influence on technology going forwards.
Thank you. Now, just to take it back to Bobo, and let's zoom into this against this backdrop of the diluting power of the big states. What do we make of this Russia-China relationship? What does it mean, and what doesn't it mean, well, for the West? And even on a wider scale, you have been tracking it for quite a few years. Please, the floor is yours.
Before I do that, can I just go back to pick up something that Julia highlighted? I think it's really important that it's not just that the great powers are in decline. That's not really the issue. It's more that power itself has become much more diffuse and disaggregated. And so it's not just a question of declining America or declining West, rising China, stagnating Russia or whatever. It's that non-state actors are much more influential now than they have been in the past. Societal actors are much more important. I may not have liked the outcome of the Brexit process, but what it did show was that societies are increasingly involved in the making of foreign policy. Foreign policy is no longer just an elite preserve. It used to be that the assumption was that the public was only really interested in domestic goals and really didn't care about foreign policy. That's no longer true. And so international policy making has become much more disaggregated, power has become much more diffuse, and this is creating a much more fluid, dynamic, but also somewhat anarchic global environment. Now, on your question on the sort of Sino-Russian partnership, I think we need to sort of establish a few truths, if you like. The one is that the Sino-Russian relationship is, as Moscow and Beijing claim, better than it's ever been. They're not lying. This isn't just official propaganda. It's actually true. But we should understand also that this is not an alliance. This is really a classic great power relationship. Now, a lot of people emphasize the ideological empathy between Moscow and Beijing, but that is not the real driver of the Sino-Russian partnership. This is driven by common interests rather than shared values. And it's an important point, because really, if we were sort of thinking about in terms of the animal kingdom and the idea of mutualism, this is a relationship that brings significant dividends to both sides, whether it's political comfort, an enhanced sense of security, military and technological expertise, geopolitical benefits, and economic gains. Now, in terms of international relations, Well, China and Russia agree on some of the main principles. So they both believe that a dominant America is undesirable. They believe in the primacy of great powers in world politics, and of course the central importance of state sovereignty. And their views also converge on many issues, be it Korea, the idea of a so-called sovereign internet, opposition to missile defense, and so on. However, China and Russia are strategically autonomous actors, and they actually have different attitudes and approaches to international order. Now, China, in my view, is what you'd call a system player. It operates on the basic premise that the existing international system, for all its flaws and limitations, continues to favor Chinese interests in the main. And therefore, what Beijing tries to do is it tries to game the system. It exploits the system's advantages, but also its shortcomings. Now, by contrast, Moscow is a system disruptor. Now, in the long term, of course, it hopes for something better. It hopes for a kind of 21st century concert of great powers in which Russia plays, okay, it's not as powerful as the United States and China, but it's powerful enough to hold the equilibrium between those two great powers. And so it exercises strategic leverage vis-a-vis both. But in the meantime, Moscow looks to exploit opportunities arising from a fluid and unstable international environment, i.e. the world disorder. Now, although China and Russia are strongly committed to their partnership, the fact that they have rather different approaches to international order means that there is actually surprisingly little coordination between them. There is no, contrary to what many would have us believe, there is no Sino-Russian conspiracy against the West, and each side has surprisingly little influence on the other's decision-making. Beijing acts on its own initiative in the Asia-Pacific region, and Moscow pursues an independent line in Europe and the Middle East. And for each side, foreign policy is a wholly sovereign affair. Now, China and Russia have become scapegoats for the crisis of the rules-based international order, and there's no doubt that many of their actions have been egregious. But we do need to recognize here, we need to take responsibility in the West. The troubles of liberalism and the liberal international order have been largely self-inflicted. What Beijing and Moscow have done, and sometimes unconscionably, is to exploit our failings and our shortcomings, but they did not cause them. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Just to follow up on a few things.
Sure.
Keeping in mind everything that we talked about today and Julia's intervention, the state sovereignty principle of both Russia and China, isn't it becoming outdated? Isn't it a race against time, or kind of living a little bit in the self? It's a little bit of lying to themselves because the system is changing, as you've also outlined. And another thing I just wanted to quickly point out, just recently, I think a few days ago, a new article came out by Igor Denisov, where he talks about this Russian increasing hedging against China. So this perception that Russia is losing out by granting China control. So I wonder, what do you think of this increasing hedging analysis, and whether you would agree with it? And then I will have another question for you. So please don't put your pen down just yet.
Okay, so. I think that your first question is really putting the idea that Russian and Chinese views of the primacy of states are outdated. Personally, yes, I agree with you. The trouble is, it's not only Russia and China who believe in the primacy of states. It's pretty much every national government in the world, starting with the Biden administration. So in a way, the problem is not just with Russia and China, it's with governments, democratic and authoritarian, hybrid, all over the world because they are, in a sense, trying to address 21st century challenges with very much state-centered 19th and 20th century thinking. And surprise, surprise, it's not working. so that is a problem. But it's not just China and Russia, it's everyone effectively. Now, is Russia hedging against China? Yes and no. This comes back to the point I made about what Russia wants in the longer term. Russia essentially envisages a tripolar order. Now, it knows that the United States and China will be the two strongest powers, the most multidimensional, most influential in the world for decades to come. So in a certain level, Russia can't compete with it. But Russia can compete to the extent that it can play both sides against the middle. It can exercise strategic leverage. Its cooperation, or at least acquiescence, is needed by both sides. And this is what Russia is hoping to achieve. So Putin, this is why concepts that people think, oh, look, Russia and China are getting together. No, that's not really the case. What Russia is trying to do is to exercise the maximum possible strategic leverage. And it identifies that the Sino-Russian partnership is actually a force multiplier for Russian power and influence around the world. Now, people talk about the China-Russia relationship being asymmetrical, unbalanced, and they sort of imagine that Russia is somehow this lackey that is enslaved by this partnership. I think that's a fundamentally incorrect perception. Now, of course, Russia is economically far inferior to China. But Russia still has tremendous leverage in other areas. And one of the sources of its leverage is that China today is so extraordinarily unpopular, not just in the West, but across much of the rest of the world. And so this actually gives Russia leverage. Russia is in the perfect position, as it were, that a lot of countries prefer it to at least China or the United States, or in some cases both. So in other words, Russia has become the lesser evil. It's certainly the lesser evil to Washington. It's gone from being the chief bogeyman of successive US administrations to being, well, maybe not an ally, but maybe we can sort of neutralize it. We can park Russia. And this is a perfect situation. And meanwhile, what friends does China have? It has basically no friends. Russia is the nearest thing that China has to a friend. And this gives Russia plenty of play and plenty of scope to pursue its longer term strategic ambitions.
Thank you. Well, states might believe in their primacy, as you correctly pointed out, but at the same time, they're kind of clumping together to protect themselves against the new realities. And of course, I'm pointing my finger at the microlateral formations such as AUKUS and the Quad. So I want to talk to you about the great powers and how their behavior is impacting the international system. I think you already touched upon this in your address, but still, so kind of let us move towards the future projections, the most hated part of any conversation for a political analyst, I understand, but please, in terms of the projections on the impact on the international system. Bobo, please.
Okay, so all right. You talk about microlateralism, and it's clear, it's quite interesting what Biden has been doing, because on the one hand, Biden talks about a rules-based international order. But on the other hand, he clearly doubts America's capacity to bring about such an order. And so what he's really doing is going back to smaller groups, associations of so-called like-minded countries, hence the Quad, hence AUKUS, and to some extent also his forthcoming Summit for Democracy. So basically he's essentially saying that I can't change the world, but I can rally the democracies of the world together. So that kind of smaller group caucusing is key to Biden's approach. So I actually think that what Biden's trying to do is, he's not so much influenced by classical Wilsonian, Clintonian ideas of liberal internationalism. He's actually going back to George W. Bush's coalition of the willing in 2003, because he's basically saying, these are our friends, these are our mates, let's get together, let's tighten up and confront this existential, multidimensional threat that China presents to us. Now, I think to some extent, so, you know, it's internationalist, but it's internationalism with a twist. Now, where is this all going? I'm quite worried. I'm concerned that the potential for conflict is now greater than it has been in decades. US-China relations are worse than since the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and early 70s. And by the end of the Trump presidency, US-Russia relations had slumped to a 3-decade low. The real worry, though, about US-China relations is that they are not just confrontational. I mean, there are 3 aspects. It's the depth, the intensity of the mutual animosity. It's the breadth of the confrontation. There is no area of US-China interaction that is exempt from this mutual hostility. And there are also multiple flashpoints. So Taiwan, South China Sea, Senkaku Jiaoyu Islands, the Sino-Indian border, the Korean Peninsula, and of course, China's rapid expansion of its strategic nuclear arsenal. So multiple flashpoints. That's what worries me. Now, of course, Washington and Beijing, they don't want to fight a war. But the thing is, there is plenty of scope for accidents to happen because there's so much mutual hostility, mistrust, and indeed hubris that an accident is, some would argue, not a matter of if, but when. And of course, the consequences might be unintended, but that doesn't make them any less catastrophic. Now, we tend to think of just focus on US-China, but what about Russia and the West? I actually think that a conflict in Europe is just as plausible, because I think that Putin has been emboldened by Biden's efforts to stabilize or normalize US-Russia relations. We've seen a marked escalation of Moscow's rhetoric against Kiev. They are openly calling into question, and in pretty vigorous language, the sovereignty of Ukraine. So given Biden's preoccupation with China and his, let's be honest about this, lack of resolve vis-a-vis Russia, it is possible that Moscow could be tempted into exercising a limited military option at some stage if a suitable opportunity arises. Now, this won't, I think, target the Baltic states because the Baltic states are protected to some extent by their membership of NATO and the EU. But I'd say that I would be not at all surprised if Putin declared the Donbass area to be Russian territory or an independent stateless.
Thank you, Bobo. Julia, this is quite a pessimistic picture that Bobo just outlined. Do you have anything to add or maybe to object for all our sakes? We cannot hear you just yet.
Apologies, I put myself on mute because my cat was going crazy. But no, I really agree with Bobo's perspective. So it was well said, Bobo.
Thank you. Then I have a question for you. Why do we even talk about Russia as a big power? I mean, you as a person who has ranked countries and in terms of their cyber powers and definitely has developed, with your team, has led a team to develop an established methodology for ranking, which is an extremely complicated thing. If we had to list the big powers today, where does Russia even come in? What is behind our perception of Russia as a great power? Is it justified? Could it maybe just be because of the memories of the Cold War era, or the persona of Putin himself punching above his weight, as the saying goes? Is it Russia's disregard for rules, the fact that it is a player that you don't really know what it will do, or maybe it's something simple like the nuclear power status?
Sure. Well, let me have a stab at this question. So in terms of our ranking, I think we placed Russia 4th from the top out of 30 countries. So certainly on the cyber front, it's extremely capable and it has high intent. I think what is noticeable out of the kind of angles that we measure power within this cyber sphere is that Russia was extremely weak on norms, as in shaping international norms, as well as commerce. And for us, that means having an industrial base and having like the kind of technology that you create in-house and export to other countries. And I actually think those are two significant weaknesses on Russia's front. That means that I think long term, vis-a-vis some other countries, it could drop down. If we consider cyber holistically, because obviously Russia ranks extremely high in terms of destructive operations. I think that, as you mentioned, one of the things that makes Russia this kind of specter, like I don't know much about Russia, but from what I've read and stuff, the fact that a lot of the activities are outside of a rule book, they kind of play to their own rules. That's something that I think is the unpredictability and kind of disregard for international rules is something that is quite notable, and I think also maybe enhances people's concerns towards Russia. I often think about Russia and China together in the sense that when I'm thinking of challenges to the West then I think of those two countries. And actually, I've asked this question to some friends before, what is it? I know very little about Russia. I've spent some time thinking about China. I'm like, which is the country that concerns you the most? And obviously, it's very difficult to compare both of them, right? You cannot really compare them; they're quite different. And I think that one of my friends put it quite nicely, or kind of made sense to me. Like, Russia is like the weather, and China is the climate. And I think you've heard this phrase before, right? And sure, and actually that was the first time that I heard it, and it really resonated with me and helped me think about the kind of influence and power that both of these countries have.
Yes, that sums it up perfectly, and it was the first time, I must admit, I heard this phrase. Now, as we slowly start to wrap up this extremely interesting conversation, I want to bring you back to our topic, security outlooks of the big power era, and I want you to remember the times you were wearing your diplomat hats, and remember, kind of get back into the mindset, the diplomatic mindset, to answer my final question. We have a NATO ministerial coming up in Riga at the end of the month, and obviously NATO 2030 is a very pertinent issue. So which way for NATO? And Bobo spoke today of Russia being seen as the lesser evil, but at the same time, a conflict in Europe with a conflict in Europe just as plausible. Are we up for a deprioritization of Russia as in NATO? How do you see which way should NATO develop against the backdrop of the considerations that you both masterfully outlined just now? Now, let's start with Bobo and then to Julia.
Okay, can I, just before I answer that, can I just quickly get back onto Russia as a great power? It's fascinating to me. You can talk about nukes, historical memory, energy, cyber, but the fundamental criterion of a great power, and why Russia ranks high, in my view, third rather than fourth, is because it has a sovereign, independent foreign policy. It is able to exercise its own will to an extent that most great powers can only dream of. So, for example, compare it to the EU. The EU is much more powerful in some respects, but the EU is a powerful economic bloc, but it's a geopolitical dwarf. And its political influence is declining, and its normative influence is also declining. So the thing is, yes, the EU is more influential, more powerful than Russia, is able to do more good, but Russia exercises tremendous preventative and prophylactic, call it negative power. Now, where do we go from here? It's quite interesting. The NATO 2030 document refers to Russia 63 times, but China only 10 times. So although there's been a shift, it's at least prepared to consider that China presents major challenges for the NATO alliance and NATO member states. It's still very much Russia focused. And this is when all the talk about how successful Biden's June trip was to Europe, one thing that Biden wasn't able to do was to persuade the Europeans to fundamentally reorient their worldview from Europe to from Russia to China, from Europe to Asia. NATO is still very much a transatlantic European continent-based organization. And so while there are, it's clearly prepared to look more at China than before, Russia remains the all-consuming preoccupation, really almost the rationale for NATO's continuing existence.
It's good to hear that coming from the region that we're in. Julia, your analysis, please.
Right, so I think that like some things that should be on the table at the NATO discussion are basically the response to the challenges that I outlined at the beginning. So one is, what is the most effective way for states to respond together to cyber attacks? Really kind of thinking about whether or not this naming or shaming works, or do we need to have a method that has more teeth? In response to the misinformation and disinformation efforts, I mean, all of the countries within NATO are particularly at risk to misinformation, disinformation efforts. And so there needs to be government and industry and civil society efforts at multiple levels to introduce regulations that can limit the misinformation, disinformation activities, as well as like an effort to educate like general populations in terms of analyzing and critically engaging with what they're seeing online, because this can be a hugely divisive issue. And then finally, it's around establishing technology norms through technical standards, but also greater technical standards that uphold the shared values within various standards development organizations, and I think also within like NATO themselves. This would be like a few great steps that NATO could take to challenge or to try and respond to the cyber challenges.
Can I just follow up just briefly on Julia's point, because I think she makes a key thing. One of the things that bothers me is just how we in the West, not just NATO, EU, but also individual Western democracies, we kind of deal in cliches and name calling. You know, we waffle, you know, about rules-based international order, the free world, right side of history, our way of life, malign actors. And this is no way to confront the major challenges that China in particular directs towards us. We, i.e. Western decision makers, need to deal in the concrete. And that's what Julia's highlighted. We need to decide what our strategic aims are, what vital interests are at stake, what costs are we prepared to realize these? And most of all, we need to raise our own game. We have to tackle basic failures of governance in our own countries. We have to modernize our security, cyber, and technological capabilities. We have to push back against specific acts of Chinese and Russian aggression. And perhaps most important, we need to lead efforts to mitigate global challenges like climate change and global poverty. And that means not just talking about it, but actually being much more generous to the developing world on climate financing, vaccine access, infrastructural funding, overseas development assistance, because ultimately, talk is cheap. The rich liberal democracies of the West need to deliver, and only in that way will they show that liberalism is actually a superior way of addressing the global challenges of today.
Brilliant. Dear colleagues, thank you for joining us today at the Riga Security Forum podcast sessions, and we're hoping to see you in person one of these days, at least when we have tackled this big pandemic challenge that Bobo just outlined to some extent. Now, let me just sum up by saying that our brilliant panelists today brought some excellent points. There is some pessimism there. The potential for conflict has increased. Big state power is diluting, and power is becoming diffused. Non-state actors are much more influential and pose cyber challenges. Common interests form big state relationships rather than shared values, but there's an upside. The great powers have seldom been less able to impose their will. There is more latitude for the smaller states, including the Baltics right here. There's more autonomy in our actions. And cyber power has become more accessible to us as well, leveling out the playing field. Now it's up to us to take these opportunities. Thank you, colleagues.
Yeah, great. Thank you.